The train reached Juniper Crossing after dark, dragging sparks through the Montana snow. The platform was crowded for one reason. Elias Ward, owner of Copper Creek Ranch, had sent for a bride. When the last passenger stepped down, the entire station went silent. She wore no lace. Her blue coat was smoke-stained and patched in 3 shades of thread. A pale burn scar curved from her left jaw toward her ear. One boot was tied with rawhide. In both hands she carried a narrow wooden seed box bound with rope. Someone near the ticket window laughed. "That cannot be Ward's bride," another voice answered. "Maybe the marriage bureau sent whatever nobody else wanted." The woman heard them. Her name was Clara Bell, and she had crossed nearly 1,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. But before she looked for Elias, a ranch boy slipped beside the baggage cart. A broken crate sliced his palm. While everyone stared at her coat, Clara set down her only box, tore a clean strip from her sleeve lining, and wrapped the boy's hand. "Hold it higher," she told him. "The bleeding will slow." That was the first thing Elias Ward ever saw her do. Not beg, not explain, not try to impress him. She helped someone who could give her nothing. Elias stood beneath the station lamp in a black wool coat, tall and broad-shouldered, with snow gathering in his dark beard. At 39, he owned 12,000 acres, 700 cattle, and a ranch house large enough to hold the family he no longer believed he would have. The letter he had received described Clara differently. It called her demanding. It said she expected servants and immediate control of his money. It suggested she had accepted the arrangement because no man back east would have her. Yet the woman kneeling in the snow had just damaged her own coat to bandage a stranger. "Miss Bell?" he asked. Clara rose. Her face was tired from 4 days of travel, but her gray eyes were steady. "Yes, I'm Elias Ward." She brushed snow from her skirt. "Then I suppose we have both been waiting for a surprise." A few people snickered again. Elias looked toward them once. The platform became quiet. He lifted Clara's wooden box. It was lighter than he expected. "This is all you brought?" "It is all I kept." The wagon ride to Copper Creek took nearly 2 hours. Snow covered the road so completely that the horses followed fence posts more than tracks. Clara never asked how much land Elias owned or when the wedding would take place. Instead, she asked whether the injured boy had a doctor nearby. "No doctor until Helena," Elias said. "But Mrs. Voss in town knows most things worth knowing. The cut was clean. He will be all right if it stays that way." "You have experience with injuries?" "More than I wanted." After a while, Elias said, "The letters I received made certain claims." "What kind?" "That you expected this marriage to be a business arrangement." Clara's hand tightened beneath the blanket. "And what do you expect it to be?" "I do not know yet. That makes 2 of us." He watched the road. "You may stay through winter. You will have your own room. No decision will be forced before spring." It was not a welcome, but it was not rejection. "Thank you," she said. Copper Creek appeared at the bottom of a long valley, its barn roofs white beneath the moon. The main house was built from dark pine and river stone, 3 stories high, with wide porches and tall windows. It was impressive. It was also dark except for one lamp in the kitchen. Clara studied it. "What is it?" Elias asked. "It is a beautiful house. Most people say that. But it looks as though everyone inside has been trying not to disturb the silence." The words struck harder than they should have. Inside, polished furniture surrounded a cold fireplace. A clock ticked above the mantel. "Do you always keep the fire this low?" Clara asked. "Wood costs labor. So does being cold." For the first time, the corner of her mouth lifted. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, showed her upstairs. A feather bed stood beneath a quilt. Fresh water waited in a porcelain basin. A new blue wool dress lay across a chair, badly guessed at her size. "Mr. Ward ordered it from Helena," Mrs. Finch said. Clara touched the sleeve. It was kind of him to try. When she was alone, Clara opened the wooden box. Inside were 3 dresses, a broken-spined Bible, a packet of letters tied with green ribbon, a tin of salve, a child's knitted mitten, and a silver thimble engraved with the initials A.W. She closed her hand around the thimble. "I made it," she whispered. "I am here." Clara had once believed safety was something a family could build and keep. Her father owned a small print shop in Missouri. After her mother died and his eyesight failed, Clara set type by day and took laundry at night. She read letters for immigrant women, wrote replies for soldiers' widows, and spent whatever remained on her father's medicine. At 19, she ran into a burning boarding house because 2 children were trapped upstairs. She carried both out. A falling beam burned the left side of her face. For 3 days, the newspapers called her brave. After the bandages came off, men stopped asking her to dances. One customer told her father that a scar like hers would make marriage difficult. Her father answered, "Then marriage is too small a measure for her." Clara remembered that after he died and creditors took the print shop. She also remembered Abigail Ward. 2 years earlier, Abigail had fallen ill while visiting Denver. Clara, then working at Mercy House Infirmary, cared for her through weeks of fever. Abigail was Elias's younger sister, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted, the only person who could describe a severe Montana rancher and make Clara laugh. "You would hate Elias for the first month," Abigail once said. "Only a month, perhaps 2. He thinks silence is the same as strength." Abigail recovered enough to return home, but her lungs never healed. She and Clara continued writing about work, grief, books, and the loneliness of being misjudged. Then the letters stopped. A marriage bureau in Kansas City informed Clara that Abigail had died, but before her death she had submitted Clara's name as a possible match for Elias. Clara nearly refused. She wanted no man's pity and no dead woman's charity, but the print shop debts took her last room. Winter closed around St. Joseph. She finally wrote Elias an honest letter. She told him about the scar. She said she owned almost nothing. She could cook, sew, keep accounts, tend injuries, and work without praise. She also said she would not marry a man who wanted obedience more than partnership. That was not the letter Elias received. Clara woke before dawn on her first morning at Copper Creek. By the time the ranch hands entered, biscuits were rising beside the stove and apples were softening in a skillet. 9 men stopped in the doorway, all trying not to stare at her scar. Samuel Pike, the oldest hand, removed his hat. "Morning, Mom." "Good morning." Jonah, the youngest, stared at the table. "She made biscuits." "So far," Clara said, "they have not objected." The men laughed. Elias entered last. He noticed the room before he noticed the food. Men who usually ate in silence were passing plates. Mrs. Finch was arguing with Samuel about cinnamon. Jonah was telling Clara about a cow that had kicked through a fence. The kitchen sounded alive. Clara placed coffee at Elias's usual seat. "I did not know whether you take sugar." "I do not, neither do I." For some reason that pleased him. The change came in small things. Clara learned every man's name before the end of the week. She mended gloves, kept Sal by the stove for split knuckles, and marked Mrs. Finch's medicine bottles with raised threads because the housekeeper's eyesight was failing. She also found an 11-year-old boy named Toby sleeping in the hayloft. His mother had died. His father, a ranch hand, had been killed under a horse. The men fed Toby and gave him chores, but the boy had stopped speaking. Clara did not question him. She left a slate near the kitchen door. The next morning, one word appeared: horse. Clara wrote beneath it, "Which one?" By evening, Toby had added another word: Mabel. Mabel was an old gray mare with a white face and a habit of stealing hats. Within 2 weeks, Toby was learning letters from feed labels and cattle tallies. "Why does he listen to you?" Elias asked. "Because I do not ask him to speak before he is ready." "That is all? That is not a small thing." The first real test came during a hard freeze. A heifer went into labor with the calf turned wrong. Clara followed the men into the barn. "You should stay inside," Elias told her. "I have delivered calves. In Missouri, cattle exist east of Montana." Samuel hid a smile. For 40 minutes, the barn filled with steam and low voices. Clara guided the calf's legs forward while Elias held the heifer steady. At last the calf slid into the straw. It did not breathe. Clara cleared its mouth, rubbed its chest with burlap, and bent close. "Come on," she whispered. "You did not fight that hard to stop here." The calf coughed. Then it drew a thin breath. The men exhaled together. Elias looked at Clara. Blood and straw covered her sleeves. Her hair had fallen loose around the scar. She smiled at the calf as though no one else existed. The altered letter had claimed she disliked animals. Later, he found her washing at the pump. "You knew what to do. My father's friend kept dairy cows. That was not in your letter." Clara met his eyes. "Perhaps you did not receive all of it." The words hung between them. Elias almost asked what she meant. Then fear disguised as caution stopped him. Years earlier, a bank partner had vanished with the ranch payroll. Abigail sold her mother's jewelry to keep the hands paid. Elias recovered the money, but not his trust. He trusted land because it could be measured. He trusted cattle because illness had visible causes. People could smile while moving the knife. That was why the ugly letter about Clara had seemed believable. But every day at Copper Creek made it harder to defend. By Christmas, pine branches hung over the doors. Toby spoke his first full sentence in months when Mabel stole Elias's hat. She likes Clara better, the boy said. Every man in the yard turned. Toby froze. Clara kept currying the mare. Mabel has excellent judgment. The men laughed and Toby laughed with them. Elias did too. The next afternoon, Elias asked Clara to ride with him to the western pasture. The sky had cleared, leaving the valley bright and sharp beneath the snow. From the ridge, Copper Creek spread below them, the dark ranch house, the barns, the thin smoke rising from the bunkhouse, and cattle moving between windbreaks. Abigail loved this view, Elias said. Clara kept her eyes on the valley. I can understand why. She used to claim the house looked less lonely from up here. Did it? No, Clara glanced at him. You could have lied. I have done enough of that by staying silent. The honesty surprised them both. They rode along the fence until Elias found a post split by frost. He dismounted to repair it. Clara held the wire while he worked. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then Elias asked, "What would you have done if I had turned you away at the station? I had enough money for 2 nights above Mrs. Voss's shop, and after that, I would have found work. In a town where strangers laughed before you spoke?" Clara tightened her grip on the wire. Strangers have laughed before. That does not make it acceptable. No, but it makes it survivable. Elias drove the staple into the post harder than necessary. Clara watched him. You are angry. At them. You did not know me. I knew enough to see they were cruel. She looked toward the ranch below. Most people believe cruelty only counts when it is loud, she said. The quieter kind does more damage. A chair left empty. A job suddenly unavailable. A face that changes when the light reaches your scar. Elias rested the hammer against his leg. I noticed your scar at the station. I know. It was not the first thing I noticed. Clara met his eyes. What was? You tore your coat for Jonah. For a moment the winter seemed to hold its breath. Then Clara looked away. But not before Elias saw warmth reach her face. On the ride home they spoke about ordinary things. Spring calves, the school Toby had never attended, and whether Rosemary could survive a Montana kitchen window. It was the first conversation they had that did not feel like an examination. It was also the first time Clara allowed herself to imagine spring. That evening Clara found him staring at the dusty piano. Did Abigail play? She asked. Elias turned. How did you know, Mrs. Finch mentioned her? It was the first lie, Clara told him. A small one, but it tasted bitter. She played too loudly, Elias said. Clara smiled. That sounds like her. His eyes sharpened. You speak as though you knew her. Clara could have shown him the thimble and the letters, but she remembered Abigail's final instruction. Make him see you before he sees my wish. I meant it sounds like the way Mrs. Finch described her. Elias accepted the answer. Not completely. 3 days after Christmas, Lydia Harrow arrived in a polished sleigh. She wore red velvet trimmed with sable. Her father controlled one of the largest cattle brokerages in Kansas City. She had met Elias at stock conventions and had never hidden her interest in him. Abigail had disliked her immediately. She compliments the silver before she speaks to the cook, Abigail once wrote. That tells you everything. Clara recognized Lydia's name. The marriage bureau that contacted her was operated by Lydia's widowed aunt. Lydia entered the house as though inspecting property she expected to inherit. Elias, she said, you look more severe than ever. Then she turned to Clara. Her eyes touched the scar and moved away. How brave of you to travel so far. The word brave sounded like pity. At supper, Lydia spoke of concerts, hotels, and wealthy families. She asked whether ranch life overwhelmed Clara. Not yet, Clara said, and the size of the house. It is easier to warm now. Elias looked down to hide a smile. Lydia noticed. The next morning she found Clara alone in the sewing room. You have done well, Lydia said. At what? At making them forget what you are. Clara set down her needle. Why did your aunt's bureau change my letters? Lydia's smile weakened. So you suspected. I know what I wrote. You wrote like a woman who thought honesty made her equal to anyone. And you found that offensive? I found it unrealistic. Lydia stepped closer. Men like Elias choose wives who strengthen their name. They do not choose women who arrive with rope around a box and a scar everyone pretends not to see. Clara felt the old pain rise. Not because the words were new, because she had traveled west hoping never to hear them again. Then you have nothing to fear from me, Clara said. Lydia's gaze sharpened. I fear very little. That afternoon Lydia claimed a family brooch was missing. While Mrs. Finch searched the rooms, a folded page was found beneath Clara's dresses. Elias recognized the handwriting. It imitated Clara's letters. The page described a plan to secure his property after marriage. It said Clara would behave modestly until he trusted her. It said lonely wealthy men were easy to manage. Elias read it twice. I did not write that, Clara said. The hand matches your letters. It is an imitation. Lydia stood near the door, silent and sorrowful. Why was it in your box? Elias asked. I do not know. You are the only person with the key. I have not locked it since I arrived. Clara looked at the man who had watched her work beside him teach Toby save a calf and bring life into his house. Do you believe the page? She asked. Or do you believe what you have seen? Elias wanted to say he believed her, but fear spoke first. I believe I need time. Clara nodded slowly. That is an answer. The next 2 days were the coldest of the winter. Clara continued her work, but the warmth around her retreated. Toby left words on the slate and received shorter replies. Mrs. Finch burned bread. Samuel swore at tools that did not deserve it. Elias compared the false page to Clara's real notes. The letters looked similar, but the pressure of the pen was wrong. His instincts told him something was wrong. His fear reminded him that instincts had failed before. On the third morning he found Clara in the entry hall wearing her smoke-stained coat. The wooden box sat beside her. Jonah is taking me to Juniper Crossing, she said. The railway is closed until the storm passes. Mrs. Voss has a room above her shop. You cannot travel in this weather. I traveled here in worse. Clara, wait. For what? For me to understand, she swallowed. I have spent my entire life waiting for people to understand me after they have already decided. Toby appeared at the top of the stairs. Clara knelt and placed the slate in his hands. You keep writing. Are you coming back? He asked. The question broke something in the room. Clara looked toward Elias. He had no promise to offer her. I do not know, she told the boy. Toby ran upstairs. A door slammed. Before the wagon could leave, Jonah burst inside. Toby's gone. His coat and boots were missing, so was Mabel. They found hoofprints beyond the north pasture. Mabel had headed toward an old line cabin 6 miles away, a place Toby's father once used during roundup. Elias ordered Clara to remain at the house. She saddled a bay mare. You do not know the trail. I know Toby thinks the cabin is where his father still belongs. She had listened to the boy more carefully than any of them. They rode together. Snow struck their faces like sand. Fence posts vanished. Near the creek they found Mabel with blood on one knee and her reins dragging. Toby, Clara shouted. Only wind answered. Small boot prints descended toward the frozen water. A child's glove lay beside a break in the ice. They found Toby downstream, clinging to a root beneath the bank. One leg was trapped in the current. Elias started down, but the ice cracked under his weight. Clara tied a rope around her waist. No, he said, you are heavier. Anchor me, Clara, anchor me. She crawled onto the ice, water soaked through her sleeves. Toby's fingers slipped. Look at me, Clara called. You wrote horse on the slate. You wrote Mabel. Now you are going to write one more word. What word? He whispered. Home. The ice broke beneath Clara's arm. She plunged shoulder deep into the creek. Elias hauled on the rope as Clara caught Toby's coat and pushed him toward the bank. Samuel, following their trail, grabbed the boy. Elias pulled Clara from the water seconds before the current took her. For one terrible moment, she did not move. Then her eyes opened. I dislike, she whispered through chattering teeth. Montana winters. Elias laughed once, almost a sob, and lifted her into his arms. At the line cabin, they wrapped Toby and Clara in blankets while Samuel built a fire. Elias could not stop seeing her disappear beneath the ice. No woman planning to use his wealth would risk her life for an orphaned boy on the morning she meant to leave. Yet Clara had not done it to prove anything. That was why it proved everything. When they returned to Copper Creek, Lydia was gone. So was the false page. Elias stood in the empty guest room and felt certainty turn into shame. Clara developed a fever that night. For 2 days, Elias sat outside her room because he had not earned the right to sit inside. On the second evening, Clara spoke Abigail's name in her sleep. The wooden seed box stood open beside the bed. Mrs. Finch had searched it for dry clothes. A packet of letters lay on top. Elias saw his sister's handwriting. He waited until Clara woke. You knew Abigail? Yes. How? I cared for her at Mercy House. After she returned home, we wrote. Elias picked up the silver thimble. This was hers. She gave it to me after I repaired her coat. She said I made smaller stitches than any reasonable person. A broken laugh escaped him. That sounds like her. Why did you not tell me? Because she asked me not to use her love as a door into your house. She arranged the bureau contact. She suggested it. I almost refused. Why did you accept? Clara closed her eyes. Because I was tired of surviving in rooms where no one would have noticed if I disappeared. The answer stripped away every defense he had left. I am sorry. Elias said. Clara opened her eyes. I know. Forgiveness had not entered her voice. Not yet. The truth arrived the next morning on a lathered horse. The rider was Lydia's older brother, Caleb Harrow. He placed 3 envelopes on Elias's desk. The first held Clara's original letters. The second held practice sheets where Lydia had copied her handwriting. The third was sealed with green wax bearing a small pine branch. Abigail's seal. My aunt's bureau received Miss Bell's application, Caleb said. Lydia read it. She wanted a marriage between our families. When she learned Abigail had named Miss Bell, she changed the letters. You knew? Later, I told myself it was family business. Then Lydia bragged that she planted proof in Miss Bell's box. Caleb lowered his head. I have spent most of my life confusing loyalty with cowardice. Elias lifted the sealed envelope. Where did you get this? My aunt found it among Abigail's papers after the funeral. Lydia hid it before it could be mailed. Elias broke the seal. Elias, you will be tempted to distrust Clara Bell. Not because she is untrustworthy, but because mistrust has become the lock you place on every door. Clara sat beside me when fever made me cruel. She read to women who had no family. During the Mercy House fire, she carried 2 patients down a smoke-filled stair. Everyone else fled. The scar on her face is not evidence that life rejected her. It is evidence that she entered the fire when others would not. Do not marry her because I admired her. Do not pity her because the world has been unkind. See what she does when no one is rewarding her. Then decide whether your house is safe or cold, or whether safety was never the same thing as living. Your stubborn sister, Abigail. Elias carried the letter upstairs. Clara sat beside the window, wrapped in a quilt. Toby slept in a chair near her bed, one hand around the slate. Caleb brought the original letters, Elias said. He confessed. And Lydia? Gone east. He read Abigail's letter aloud. When he finished, the only sound was Toby breathing. Abigail was right about me, Elias said. She often was. I saw what you did here. I saw it every day. Then one false page appeared, and I let an old betrayal speak louder than you. Clara looked at him. I cannot spend my life proving I am not what cruel people say. You should not have to, and I will not stay because your sister asked you to see me. I know. Elias drew a slow breath. That is why I am not asking you to decide today. I am asking for the chance to become a man whose judgment deserves your trust. It was not the declaration Clara expected. It was better. It demanded work from him, not surrender from her. By the time her fever broke, the railway had reopened. She still planned to leave. Not because she hated Elias. That would have been easier. She was leaving because she loved parts of Copper Creek already. Toby's careful handwriting, Mrs. Finch's burned bread, Samuel's terrible jokes, and the sound of Elias laughing when he forgot to be guarded. Staying without trust would turn love into another room where she had to earn the right to breathe. So she packed the wooden box. Elias drove her to Juniper Crossing himself. The same platform was crowded beneath a pale morning sky. Word of Lydia's deception had traveled faster than the train. People who had laughed at Clara now found reasons to study the snow. Elias set the box at her feet. I purchased a ticket to St. Joseph. You did? You said you would not be trapped here. He handed it to her. So this is goodbye, Clara said. No, it is proof that the door is open both ways. A whistle sounded in the distance. When you arrived, Elias said, I thought wealth made me the one with something to offer. I had land, cattle, and a house full of rooms. He looked toward the townspeople, pretending not to listen. You had one box, a damaged coat, and no reason to trust us. Yet you gave Toby his voice back. You gave my men a table worth sitting around. You made my sister's piano sound possible again before anyone touched the keys. Clara's eyes filled. I do not want Abigail's choice, Elias said. I want mine. The train appeared around the bend. What exactly are you choosing? You. The word was steady. Not because you saved Toby. Not because Abigail loved you. Not because Lydia lied. I am choosing the woman who tells the truth even when it costs her shelter. The woman who makes warmth without asking who deserves it first. The woman who understood my house was cold before I did. The engine slowed. Doors opened. No one laughed this time. Clara looked at the train, the ticket, and the box tied with rope. If I return, what happens in spring? In spring, you decide whether you want to marry me. And if I do not, Copper Creek will still be your home for as long as you need it. There was fear in his face, but no demand. Clara tore the ticket once. Then again, the pieces fell into the snow. Take me home, she said. Elias did not kiss her on the platform. He took the wooden box in one hand and offered her the other. She chose it freely. That mattered more. The months that followed did not become a fairy tale. Fairy tales rarely mention frozen pipes, sick cattle, account books, or how long it takes two wounded people to stop mistaking silence for peace. Elias learned to ask before assuming. Clara learned that leaving was not the only way to protect her dignity. They opened a schoolroom in an unused wing of the house. Toby wrote the first sentence on the blackboard. "This is home." In spring, Clara planted rosemary beside the kitchen window using seeds from her wooden box. Most failed in the cold soil. 3 plants survived. Elias built small glass covers to protect them at night. In July, he asked Clara to walk beyond the south pasture, where wild flowers covered the valley. "Clara Bell, will you marry me? On 3 conditions. Name them. The school stays open. Toby remains family, not charity. And when fear makes you suspicious, you speak before you judge." Elias nodded. "When pride makes you leave, you tell me where you are going." Clara considered that. Agreed. They married in September beneath the cottonwoods. Clara wore the green wool dress Elias had ordered during her first week, altered at the waist and embroidered with tiny pine branches. The burn scar remained uncovered. She had spent too many years letting other people treat it like an apology. Toby carried the rings. Samuel forgot his hat. Mrs. Finch cooked for 50 people, and nearly 100 arrived. Some townspeople offered embarrassed kindness. Others never apologized. Clara discovered she did not need every apology in order to live well. Years passed. The schoolroom grew from 6 children to 23. Clara trained 2 young women in basic nursing and kept a winter medicine cupboard for distant ranch families. Toby became the ranch bookkeeper. Copper Creek remained a working ranch. Storms broke fences. Calves died. Money tightened in bad seasons. But the house never returned to its old silence. The wooden seed box stayed on the kitchen shelf. Its rope was gone. Inside, Clara kept Abigail's letters, the silver thimble, the torn train ticket, and a packet of rosemary seeds. Visitors admired the stone fireplaces, the wide valley, and the herds moving across the grass. Elias looked instead toward Clara at the kitchen table, surrounded by children, ledgers, medicine jars, and half-mended gloves. Then he remembered the winter night when the train delivered a woman everyone believed had arrived with nothing. They had been wrong. Clara Bell brought the one thing Copper Creek could never buy. She knew how to build warmth from almost nothing.